For 5,000 years or more than 15,000 generations, human beings have invoked spiritual power. My predecessors and yours have gathered together to make sense of their lives and their place in the cosmos. And they have spoken aloud and invited what they conceived as sacred and powerful to be with them. They called upon the spirits of air and earth, of fire and water. They called the bear and the deer. They asked for the raven to protect them. They pleaded for the heroes of old to slay the monsters of their fears. They sang songs they learned from their grandparents. And they imbued power to all kinds of spirits, to the memories of those heroes. They called them gods, and they were invoked. Vishnu and Kali, Elohim, Odin, and 100 million others. Every group of people, everywhere, they gathered to make sense of their lives and to make sense of their place in the cosmos. And they called these spirits to be present to them. And so do we. So do we gather this morning. We invoke that power, which is, we know, always around, always with us, but which we sometimes forget about. We forget that we are part of the whole of creation. We forget that we are stardust. We forget that we are capable of miracles. First among them, that we can love. We forget these things, so we invoke the power of existence so that we can remember, so that we can lift our eyes and open our ears to the true and to the beautiful. For 5,000 years or more, we have done this. In many tongues, in many ways, we have done this. And so we continue that ancient tradition in our own way, in our own time. Come, let us worship together. Please rise in body or in spirit for our opening hymn, With Joy We Claim the Growing Light, which is number 345 in your gray hymnal. You may be seated. We'll now invite forward David Temple to share with us the morning's reading.
This reading is Extremists of Justice by Martin Luther King Jr. The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, beginning the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish truth. Through violence you murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already deprived of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. The question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of justice or the extension, for the preservation of injustice or the extension of justice?
Thank you, David. Had he not been assassinated, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would have been 94 years old today. This weekend we honor the powerful legacy of Dr. King and all of those who worked alongside him in the struggle for civil rights. I recently rewatched the film Selma. Some of you may have seen that. It came out a few years ago. It's a fabulous film that depicts what happened in Selma, Alabama in March of 1965. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it. In an introduction to his book, Call to Selma, the Reverend Bill Sinkford, who was president of the UUA, writes this: Selma was a watershed event in our nation's history, perhaps the high point in our collective belief that we, together, could end racism and move ever closer to the ideal of the beloved community. By 1965, that belief had already been sorely tested. President Kennedy had been assassinated, and the resistance to dismantling America's version of apartheid had stiffened. Fault lines within the African American leadership were beginning to become more visible as Black empowerment began to move away from integration toward separatism. The story of Selma begins not with triumph, but with tragedy and with violence. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which banned segregation in public accommodations, America's Black leadership identified the right to vote as the next great priority. A march was planned to begin on March 7th, 1965, from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama's capital, to urge the passage of the Voting Rights Act. African Americans had been attempting to register to vote in Alabama and other states in the Deep South for years, but only a few had succeeded. Demonstrations had been taking place, and only 3 weeks before the targeted March 7th march to Montgomery from Selma, a 26-year-old Black man, Jimmy Lee Jackson, had been shot and killed by state troopers during a night march in Marion, Alabama. On March 7th, the day in which the march to Montgomery was to begin, 600 peaceful marchers, many of them children, teens, and old people, were attacked by state and local law enforcement officials with billy clubs, with hoses, with tear gas, driving the marchers back. This attack was televised nationally, the first time that live images of violence happening in our own country were sent into the living rooms of typical Americans. It became known as Bloody Sunday. The next day, Martin Luther King called on clergy of all faiths to join him there in Selma. Hundreds of UU ministers from around the country and with hundreds of other clergy joined those marchers. One of them was the Reverend James Reeb. In the film Selma, you will see James Reeb, a pale white man wearing dark-rimmed glasses. And following the death in the film, he is described to Martin Luther King as that priest from Boston. That was not true. The Reverend James Reeb, who was only 38 when he died, had been an associate minister at All Souls Unitarian in Washington. He had a very successful ministry there. But he wanted to work more directly for social justice. So he left the parish ministry and entered a community-based ministry in Boston. He and his wife and 4 small children left their comfortable parsonage in Chevy Chase And instead of moving into one of Boston's suburbs, they moved into a house in one of the poorest areas of Roxbury. They wanted to live with the people they would be serving. A few months later, when violence broke out in Selma, there was no doubt that James would go. The day after people arrived from around the country, another march was attempted. And one of the UU ministers there, Reverend Dick Leonard, describes what happened in his book called The Selma. On the sidewalk, we were advised to walk 6 abreast. At the head of the line was Dr. King, a number of black clergy, and as many white dignitaries as could be brought forward. The line, numbering close to 3,000, reached down the block and filled a playground area. Interspersed among the black young people, male and female, were priests, rabbis, and ministers, black and white, and what seemed a disproportionately large number of nuns in their habits. It was hard to imagine that they would be beaten or tear-gassed, and that the sight of their cheerful faces gave courage to all the others. Reverend Dick Leonard describes the festive atmosphere as the march begins. But once they reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge that they needed to cross, things began to change. They were the target of angry insults and obscenities from groups of whites on either side of the road. As they reached the crest of the bridge, this is what they saw waiting for them at the bottom. As Reverend Dick Leonard describes, about 200 state policemen in their brilliant blue uniforms and helmets lined both sides of the street, shoulder to shoulder, for a distance of several hundred feet. Beyond them, and linking one side to the other, another rank was stationed across the highway, completely blocking the line of the march. Every policeman held his club with both hands, parallel to the street, making a solid cordon of wooden clubs. We were being invited to march into a pocket in which we would be surrounded on at least 3 sides by overwhelming force. My knees turned to rubber at that awesome sight. Another UU minister, the Reverend Robert Holler, says this: "The bridge is deserted, and I think for a while that they're going to let us march to Montgomery. Then I look back, and I see the state police pulling cars behind the end of the line. And I reach the crest of the narrow bridge and look down the road to see a solid phalanx of troopers blocking the way, and posse men lining each side of it. I'm walking beside an elderly woman who says to me, 'This is where they threw the tear gas on Sunday.' 'Were you on the march?' 'Yeah,' she says. 'I've been on 8 of them.' We were marching into this box of troopers and posse men, and I don't see any way out of it. I ask her, 'Where did you go when they threw that bomb?' She says, 'You take my hand. I know the place real well.'" Another minister, the Reverend Arthur Jellis, says that he was on the 10th rank with a graying small lady on his left. He was scared, something he thought wasn't showing, until this woman reaches across the short distance between us, he says, and took my hand. "We're going to be all right." And so it was. These inexperienced clergy soon learned that in the event of trouble, the children were much faster and much more alert than the adults, and knew how to protect themselves much better than the adults. In effect, these children were protecting me more than I was protecting them, said another UU minister. As I said earlier, it was primarily children, youth, and elders who were demonstrating and marching. It was too dangerous for their parents to be out there because pictures were being taken. And if working people were photographed, they would surely lose their jobs. An 8-year-old girl tells how it finally struck her that she might die. She says, "I might be in a march and someone would shoot and I'd be hit. Or I might be in the church when a bomb went off. Or I might be singing in front of the courthouse and a deputy might hit me with a club. I might die. When she told her mother how scared she was, she says, "Mama cradled me. You're not going to die, doll," she croons. "No, ma'am, you ain't." But after that night, my mama began taking part in the marches. She didn't join them, but every time we marched, she'd walk beside us, and we'd be at the courthouse. I'd see her standing over on the sidewalk, keeping her eyes on me. These are the words of the 8-year-old Shion Webb, an 8-year-old. In the film, you will see that this march is aborted when it dawns on Martin Luther King that they had entered into a trap. He drops to his knees in prayer, and all the marchers follow suit. And then he rises, turns, and leads the marchers back to Brown Chapel. It is that evening that the Reverend James Reeb and 2 of his UU colleagues were attacked as they were leaving a black-owned restaurant. James's injuries were so severe that he died 2 days later. It was the death of James Reeb that finally spurred Lyndon Johnson to act. During an address to a joint session of Congress just a few days later, President Johnson said this: "At times, history and fate meet at a single time and a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama." The Voting Rights Act was finally passed following the death not of Jimmy Lee Jackson, but of a white man, the Reverend James Reeb. At James Reeb's memorial service, Martin Luther King delivered James Reeb's funeral oration, in which he began by saying, "Who killed Jim Reeb?" King answered, "A few ignorant men." King then asked, "What killed Jim Reeb?" And he answered, "An irrelevant church, an indifferent clergy, an irresponsible political system, a corrupt law enforcement hierarchy, a timid federal government, and an uncommitted Negro population." He exhorted us to, quote, "leave the ivory towers of learning and storm the bastions of segregation, and see to it that the work that James Reeb had started be continued, so that the white South might come to terms with its conscience." It seems important that we remember what happened in Selma so many years ago. The sacrifices that were made in one more step toward justice and equality. It would be wonderful, of course, if we could look back and feel pride that we are now living in a post-racial society, the kind of society that some were touting when we elected our first black president. But we know, of course, that this is not so. We're still living in a society where you can be stopped for driving while black, or shot while walking home from a corner store. We're killed for selling cigarettes one at a time, or thrown to the ground while attempting to reach your 12-year-old black brother who is lying on the ground, dying from yet another bullet. I know that it is tempting here in our comfortable suburbs to feel horror at hearing the stories of what is happening out there someplace, and then return to our everyday, safe lives. What can we do, really, beyond looking at ourselves and knowing that we would not harbor the hostility and hatred displayed by the white people of Selma over 50 years ago? And yet, I'm guessing that you may still hear racism in the voices of your neighbors or coworkers, or even members of your extended families. There's still work for us to do, even here in our comfortable suburbs. If James Reeb was a hero, he was a quiet type of hero. He was just someone who felt called to help make a small difference in the world. He had been called into the ministry, a Presbyterian ministry to begin with, until he could no longer believe in that creed and became a Unitarian Universalist instead. He was successful in the parish, but realized that he would be happier if he could work directly with those in need of the kind of ministry that he could offer, people on the margins of society. When the call to Selma came, he didn't hesitate. But like hundreds of other clergy, he went. He was one of those who didn't take the easy way out, but instead kept searching for his authentic voice and his authentic work. He was a hero. He was a quiet hero. Now, perhaps this is what we are called to do as well as we face important decisions and decide that we will follow the ideals, the values, and principles that ground us. Some of these decisions are big ones, like how we're going to earn our livings and with whom we're going to share our lives and where and how we're going to live. But each day we make decisions about how we're going to spend our time and our money, and how we're going to relate to the people around us, and how we're going to interact with the planet that sustains us, and which causes we're going to support. We all have the potential to be quiet heroes like James Reeb, if only we would remember that it is in our everyday lives that we are presented with choices that will determine who we are intended to be. The moments of quiet heroism that you and I face will probably never be covered on the evening news. Usually we are alone when we make these decisions that speak to our deepest values, but that in no way diminishes their spiritual importance. James Reeb was a quiet hero because of the compassionate and consistent way he lived his life every day. It matters profoundly that we go and do likewise. So may it be. Amen.